Yeah, I mean, I assumed that that was likely the case. I think the reason that I highlighted specific features is because there's been a feature recently that's gotten a lot of attention. I don't know if it's the removal of a feature, if it's a new feature, but of course I'm talking about this dislike button situation. And I've been following a little bit on, I mean, obviously I saw the original release, but then I've seen some of the feedback from creators that are in my circle a little bit. Maybe you can give me like a brief background on that particular decision, the removal of the dislike button, and sort of YouTube's position on why this was an important thing to do.
Yeah, and so I mean, I'll kind of take a step back, and some of this will tie to my answer to some of your previous questions too, because I think it'll illustrate the types of, the way that the decision making around these types of features and kind of product decisions are actually going down at YouTube. And so this was, of course, a decision, and as you described, an adjustment to a feature or whatever you want to call it, that of course I was involved in. Other members of the leadership team here at YouTube, of course, were involved in as well, and it's an example of something that involves those trade-offs that I was talking about before. At the end of the day, YouTube is a very large ecosystem of viewers and creators and other partners, and it was about making sure that we were, kind of balancing all of those in sometimes sort of competing objectives or competing goals in a decision that we felt was the right sort of overall decision for the ecosystem. And so that was kind of our North Star and what we were trying to anchor on in terms of this particular decision. And leading up to it, we didn't, just come up with it out of the blue, as you can imagine. There was a lot of thought that went into it. In fact, we ran a couple of experiments ahead of time to actually gather some data and learn, the impact of dislike counts on the ecosystem. What was the impact on creators, on viewers, etc. And we learned a couple of things. One is that if you do remove the number right next to the actual dislike the button per se, it does remove some of the incentive for the behavior of people swarming and sort of, the disliking a particular video as a swarm activity as opposed to sort of an individual action. So that was one key learning. The second was we also learned that the types of videos or the type of content that was particularly prone to that type of an attack, dislike attack, if you will, were smaller creators that were up and coming, creators that didn't have sort of some of the infrastructure that other larger creators had. And so those were two key insights that we had. And so kind of taking all of this into account led us to the decision that we want to have the ability for people to express their opinion about a video. So that's why dislikes weren't removed completely. It was just the count. And we wanted to provide that feedback mechanism to the creators. That's why obviously YouTube Studio still has, that functionality available so that creators can avail it of themselves. And so the best sort of way to really thread this needle was to keep the action, but to remove that count that was incentivizing what was some of the problematic behavior. And so that was a lot of the thought process that went into it. There were a number of, kind of reviews and decisions, input that came from viewers, from creators, small and large, that fed into that particular feature. And that's the mechanism that led to that decision and how we rolled it out. Just to give you sort of like, kind of the full background in terms of how that actually went down.
Yeah, and that's, I personally, I find it very interesting. In a much smaller way, I run a business myself. We make decisions, and sometimes it comes from one place and is reviewed by somebody else. Like I totally assumed that this would have gone through a process, that it wouldn't have been some sort of like instantaneous snap your fingers, dislike is gone. There would have been some thinking that went into it. And even before that, before I heard about it, I could imagine it happening also because the dislike button in general elsewhere on the internet is kind of non-existent. Across other social media platforms that are out there, you just don't see it. And so there's a thinking that, okay, there must be some reason why having this count, it must have some sort of a negative effect. But then there are also other people out there that feel that there was something positive about having that there. So let me ask you this: what is when you guys were doing the analysis on, the good side of doing something like this, what's the bad side of doing something like this? What's the negative of hiding this number?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is, like I said, I mean, these types of decisions are difficult because they do involve this trade-off, these pros and cons as you're describing, and as you're seeing, we ultimately erred on the side of what we think is we went with the side that we think is sort of the best decision for the overall ecosystem, and that is removing the count. The feedback that I have heard is, well, the count was useful as a indicator of whether I should, watch that video or not. And, part of the experiments that we ran was to understand whether content on YouTube was being impacted by the removal of that count or not. And as you probably know, dislikes are certainly one piece of input, but there's lots and lots of signals that our recommendation algorithms take into account in terms of surfacing personalized recommendations for all of our viewers. And it turned out that that count wasn't actually having any meaningful impact on the viewership that videos were getting, meaning that, viewers were watching the videos that they wanted to watch, wanted to consume. That was factoring into videos that were being recommended to them via our personalization algorithms, and all of that was working fine with or without that count. So that was sort of one piece of feedback that I heard that I think our experiments showed wasn't really playing out that way. And then obviously there's the kind of aspect of it's a signal for our creators, of course, in terms of the feedback on the content that they're producing, the videos that they're producing. And that's, of course, why we left the information in place in YouTube Studios, so that creators, when they're going through the creative process, when they're going through kind of ideation for the next, set of videos or content that they're going to produce, that input is still there. And of course, as you do every single day, there's lots and lots of things that go into those types of decisions, not just that, but we did hear loud and clear that was one aspect of it, and that's why we kept it available as a tool for our creators. So those were like the two things that that I had heard even before this rollout, and that was sort of the way that I thought about them in terms of sort of making the decision that we did.
Yeah, I think when I initially heard about this, I had a immediate sense that there's like kind of huge creator stuff and then just starting out creator stuff, and that those perspectives can actually be quite far apart. And when people approach me and say, "Hey, that's so cool that you're publishing to YouTube and that you're a YouTuber," and then they immediately follow it up with like, "I would love to do that," or "I want to publish as well," and then I imagine that, and I try to remember as well what that process was like. And those initial videos that you publish and that sentiment and that feedback that you're getting, and how important that is as far as acting as fuel to keep you going and keep you publishing. And obviously YouTube being a place where you want everybody to upload everything there, obviously, and you want anybody who has something, a passion in a particular area or something like this that wants to publish, you of course want that to be encouraged. But a lot of people out the gate might not be super comfortable with this glaring kind of the badge on top of their content. And so I think that big creators don't have to necessarily think about that in that way, because the ratios are all pretty consistent once you hit a certain, I mean, there's obviously outliers. So, and I think probably the same is true around the psychology as to why so many other video sites and social media sites don't bother with showing the dislike count publicly. It's encouraging for someone else to publish, that hasn't published before, because that's at least not one risk. It's removing one risk. But anyway, that's sort of, I don't know if that was any part of the thinking on your end as well.
One thing that I'll say, Lou, is like the way you characterize it is actually a lot of the feedback that I heard from other large creators as well. Even creators who, might not have initially been comfortable with the decision. And I value that part of the kind of the YouTube sort of ecosystem, sort of culture, if you will, a great deal, which is large creators don't forget sort of where they started from. And a big part of what they feel is their responsibility is, kind of the next generation or the up and coming creators. And so even when my teams were receiving feedback on the dislike button, there was always this acknowledgement that clearly my experience is probably quite different than it is for, creators starting off today, in terms of the way you're describing it. Also in terms of, who is just more vulnerable to, a concerted attack, not just, kind of in a general sense. And so I did hear that actually from other large creators as well.
Now, do you think that there's any, this is the last question on this subject. I have a few other questions, but do you think there's any chance, because it has become a hot topic and there still exist differing opinions on the subject. Do you think there exists a possibility of a hybrid where a creator who feels very passionately about having this ratio displayed, where they could have on their channel exclusively the old ratio representation? Is there any possibility of such an option?
So we haven't actively discussed that. So I don't have anything kind of new to share on that aspect today. I mean, this, a big part of the way that we build features and, products at YouTube is continual input, continual conversation with our creators. That's one of the aspects of my job that I love the most, frankly, is getting to talk to people like yourselves, your, colleagues throughout the YouTube ecosystem. So there's no plans like that today, but, we're always, involved in the dialogue and having conversations with our creators.